Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new edition of the ERS Monograph podcast. I'm Guido Marchi, pulmonologist at the University Hospital of Pisa in Tuscany, Italy, and I'm joining you today as a member of the ERS Monograph editorial board, serving as the early career member representative. In this episode, we will be discussing the newly published ERS Monograph on Bronchiectasis, the third edition dedicated to this topic, and the first in over 8 years. It is a comprehensive and timely resource that reflects the remarkable progress our field has made in understanding, diagnosing, and treating this condition. I'm really honored and delighted to welcome two of the guest editors, Professor Amelia Shoemark, Asthma and Lung UK Chair of Respiratory Research at the University of Dundee, Scotland, and Professor Stefano Aliberti, Professor of Respiratory Diseases at Humanitas University and Chief of the Respiratory Unit at Humanitas Research Hospital in Milan, Italy. So thank you both very much for being here. It's a real privilege for me to have such a remarkable expertise representative in this discussion. So let's start from the beginning. As an icebreaker, let's say, I'd love to hear a little bit about your personal journeys and how each of you first became involved in the fascinating field of bronchiectasis. So Amelia, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I was a clinical scientist working in the National Health Service in the UK, and I was given the opportunity to do a PhD in inflammation in bronchiectasis, for which I will be forever grateful because it became very clear very quickly that it's an interesting field and there was a big unmet need. And as a scientist, I think it's an area where I felt that science and research and data could really make an impact. And I've really stayed in the field, I think, because of the community. So I met James Chalmers and Stefano and became part of EMBARC. And it's a really collaborative, positive community, I think, making meaningful change. And I think the monograph really reflects that and the progress since I did that PhD in bronchiectasis and inflammation.
Thank you very much, Amelia, for sharing your experience. Stefano, what about you? What first sparked your interest in bronchiectasis?
Well, I've been working in the field of respiratory infections since many, many years. And at some point, I would say 20 years ago, I thought about bronchiectasis being a very neglected disease. I was wondering why actually people were talking about COPD, asthma, and there were some patients with a very bad quality of life because of sputum production, because of frequent exacerbations, green sputum, and with bronchiectasis on CT scan. And actually, there was this misdiagnosis for these patients, especially in some of the countries, including Italy. So I started working with James Chalmers and Eva Polverino from UK and Spain, tried to better understand why bronchiectasis was a neglected disease, both financially, clinically, and also scientifically, right? So I get passionate about this disease, and after a few years, we founded EMBARC, and then the story started. There was a huge community, as Professor Shoemark said, of researchers, scientists, clinicians, patients, physiotherapists, very passionate on this disease. And we started building up this community. The European Respiratory Society back in 2015 actually was giving us some funds through the CRC of the ERS. That was EMBARC 1. We developed the registry, and then the biobank Professor Shoemark is the principal investigator of. Now we are building up EMBARC 4. So it's been a very long journey.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for sharing this with all of us. And it's very clear that personal commitment, scientific curiosity, and the very concrete needs of patients have been the common thread throughout your careers. And I think this spirit comes through very clearly in this monograph. And so, Stefano, we know that bronchiectasis is a condition that profoundly affects daily life. Chronic cough, fatigue, exacerbations, burden of daily airway clearance, and so on. Yet, as you said, it's frequently under-recognized and diagnosed at a late stage. How can we better integrate the patient voice, let's say, both into clinical practice and research? And what does this monograph contribute, in your opinion, in this regard?
Well, actually, we have been working with patients since 2015. I remember 3 patients chairing the ERS task force for the first ERS guidelines on bronchiectasis. And also remember Marta Almagro opening the first World Bronchiectasis Conference 10 years ago. So we have learned a lot from patients. And what I've learned is that actually patient voice should not be something we add at the end of the process. We should actually shape the entire process from the beginning with the patients for educational projects, for advocacy projects, but also from a research project. And the reason why is because patient can teach us about the real priorities, right? For education and for research. We involve patients in research, in study designing, in selecting the endpoints, in interpreting the results, in drafting the case report form, and also the latest 2025 ERS guidelines on bronchiectasis. So patients involved in the entire process. So the monograph is extremely important because it elevates the patient perspective within this educational and scientific framework. It reminds us that bronchiectasis is not just a radiological or clinical condition, but actually is a large chronic disease. And integrating patient voice can help us to better understand what are the meaningful outcomes and what is the most relevant research we should think about in order to address those needs, right? I think the monograph actually legitimates patient experience within this educational and scientific project.
Thank you very much, Stefan. This is a really, truly powerful point, and really one that resonates across the whole of respiratory medicine. I believe that patient perspective is not a complement to the science, as you said, but it's definitely part of the science. And this brings us to the evidence behind that. So, Amelia, the EMBARC registry has transformed our understanding of bronchiectasis at a population level. Let's say, what has real-world evidence taught us that clinical trials simply could not? And how should the real-world evidence shape maybe future research and also guideline development, in your opinion?
The EMBARC registry has been really game-changing in bronchiectasis, and many of the chapters of the monograph focus on things that we've learned from the registry, and we really do learn things at a population level. So when we're doing trials, you have a selected population with patients who meet strict criteria, whereas the registry data from EMBARC, there's now over 20,000 people. We've learned more about how common Pseudomonas is, and which is bad and is associated with bad outcomes in bronchiectasis, and the distribution across countries. We've learned more about overlap syndrome, so overlap with COPD and overlap with asthma. We've also learned more about exacerbations, causes of exacerbations, and the relationship between symptoms and exacerbations. And all of these things are covered in the monograph. One important study that Stefano did a couple of years ago from the registry was looking at sputum colour. And really, we know that sputum colour reflects inflammation in bronchiectasis, and we now know that inflammation really is a driver of disease. And Stefano was able to look at sputum colour of all of the patients in the registry and importantly tie it to long-term outcomes, because we have long-term data now in the registry, including mortality and exacerbations over a number of years, and able to show that that disease activity and having inflammation is not a good thing. One thing I wanted to say about registries was that one of the really great things about EMBARC is that it was built to be combined with other global registries. So there's a Chinese registry, an Indian registry, US, Canada, and other countries. And we're now starting to do some work combining all of those registries together to really get a global picture of bronchiectasis. So I think there's a lot to learn still about bronchiectasis across the world, but the registries have played a huge part. And going forward, probably doing some pragmatic trials from the registries as well as the structured clinical trials.
Thank you very much, Amelia, for sharing this extremely interesting perspective. And all this evidence also from the EMBARC, Stefano, is precisely what has shaped the new ERS guidelines. These represent a major milestone, let's say. And what are the most impactful updates for clinical practice, and what barriers remain to their implementation across different healthcare systems, in your opinion?
I think that the 2025 ERS guidelines represent a major step forward for several reasons, mainly because they formalize a structured and I would say a more personalized approach to bronchiectasis. If you go through the guidelines, I think that it's clear a shift toward a more structured, treatable, trait-based, individualized approach. For example, there is an important emphasis on the assessment of patients, including the etiology, microbiology, comorbidities, with two major evaluations that we are supposed to do in clinical practice. One is about disease severity, and for the first time, the guidelines are talking about disease activity. Both disease severity and disease activity are drivers for our pharmacological and non-pharmacological interventions. For example, for the first time, we introduced the concept of a patient at high risk for exacerbations, which is pretty new for prescribing long-term treatments. The 2017 guidelines from the ERS suggested long-term treatments for people with 3 or more of exacerbations in the previous year. But over the past decades, we recognize that severe symptoms are important as predictors of exacerbations. And this concept of including symptoms in the concept of a patient at high risk of exacerbation, it's a novelty of the guidelines. Another important point, in my opinion, is that the guidelines discourage inappropriate treatments, such as the routine use of inhaled corticosteroids in bronchiectasis patients without asthma or COPD. I agree that many healthcare systems lack access to key components of care, such as respiratory physiotherapy, for example. The guidelines are suggesting respiratory physiotherapy to all patients with bronchiectasis. There are some components of care like specialist centers or structural pathways, and EMBARC is working on defining criteria for bronchiectasis centers in Europe. So the guidelines are strong, but translating them into real-world practice remains for us the main priority. So we need implementation strategies, pathways, network, quality indicators, and the EMBARC community actually is working on that.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for sharing your experience. And I really believe this point is crucial. Translating these guidelines into consistent practice across diverse health systems is the work that remains. And I believe it involves all of us. And speaking of new options, Stefano, with DPP1 inhibitors now entering clinical practice and a number also of promising agents in the pipeline, are we approaching a turning point for bronchiectasis treatment? And how should clinicians and researchers navigate this rapidly, let's say, changing scenario?
I agree, Guido. We are approaching a very important turning point, but we should, I think, interpret this transition very carefully. For many, many years, bronchiectasis management was mainly based on giving antibiotics, doing airway clearance, with the idea of preventing exacerbation. But what is changing now is thanks to important research that has been done in the past, is the introduction of mechanisms-based therapies. So therapies that can target specific endotypes and specific kind of inflammation, like the neutrophilic inflammation. So you mentioned the DPP1 inhibitors. These represent a major step forward because they are targeting a central biological pathway in bronchiectasis, which is neutrophilic inflammation. The point is that the DPP1 inhibitors will not replace the existing treatments. So the future lines, I think, mainly based on understanding how we can combine therapies in a very personalized way. So as clinicians, we should be able to identify the right patients, to understand the underlying biology, and the bridge study that Professor Shoemark is leading is one of the major objectives. And then we should try to integrate the old and the new treatments within a very comprehensive model of care. So the challenge here from a research point of view is that us as a scientist, we need to focus on biomarkers, endotyping, and try to use these to better improve long-term outcomes of these patients through old and new treatments.
The question now is, what comes next? Amelia, chapter 25 of this monograph is dedicated to research priorities. In your view, which are the most urgent gaps in the field that must address in the coming years? And where do the greatest opportunities lie?
Yeah, I really enjoyed writing that last chapter because I think it really focuses your mind as to where things need to go. And we've made huge progress since the first monograph on bronchiectasis, but there are still lots of unmet needs and lots of work to do. As Stefano said, continuing to unpick that heterogeneity. So people do have different disease courses and they respond differently to treatments. And I think it's important. We've learned from our early work that if you can understand the pathways, then you can develop treatments. So really unpicking that heterogeneity of the disease, identifying endotypes and identifying people at risk and who will respond to treatment is going to be really important going forwards. As well, early identification and screening. So once bronchiectasis occurs in the lungs and the structural damage is done, maybe that's too late, or not too late, but we could do better. So I think it's going to be really important to do genetic studies to try and identify symptoms that identify people at risk, continue to raise awareness so that we can identify who's going to get bronchiectasis and try and stop disease progression, I think is the ultimate goal for the future.
It's a really clear research agenda, and one that this monograph, I think, will help to catalyze by providing both the state of the art and also the gaps that remain to be filled in. And so we're nearing the end of our conversation, and I'd like to close with this question for both of you. What is the one message you would like our listeners to take home from this monograph? So we can start from you, Amelia.
Yeah, so think about bronchiectasis because there are therapies and we need to continue on the trajectory to unpick the heterogeneity through strong collaboration and identification of early disease.
Thank you very much, Amelia. And what about you, Stefano?
Well, I would mainly echo what Professor Shoemark just said. The bronchiectasis is a common, impactful, and increasingly treatable condition. So I would see the future of care depending on three major pillars. One, an earlier diagnosis. Two, as we mentioned at the beginning, a true integration of patient perspectives. And three, the development of a personalized mechanisms-based therapy. And I think that actually the monograph reflects this transition very well, bringing clinical science, patient experience, evolving treatments all together.
Thank you very much, Stefano, and thank you both so much for being here today and for sharing your insights, your experience, and your vision with all our listeners. Bronchiectasis has come a really long way from an overlooked orphan condition to a field with international registries, evidence-based guidelines, and also disease-specific therapy. And this monograph stands as both a testament to that journey and a roadmap for what lies ahead. And to our listeners, I highly encourage you to explore the individual chapters of this monograph. You can find this podcast along with other ERS Monograph podcasts on the ERS Respiratory channel. And we look forward to welcoming you to the next episode, which will continue to explore topics of high clinical and scientific relevance. So thank you very much for joining us today.